Hello, everybody. Welcome to the St Andrews Psychedelic Society. This is actually our fourth event. So the Psychedelic Society was just born like 3 weeks ago here. And I'm joined today with my great friend, Kenneth. Kenneth is a PhD graduate from University of Oxford, specializing in psychedelic neuroscience. And I think he will be starting his postdoctoral research at Stanford, actually. So it's really exciting stuff, Kenneth. Amazing to see you. As you mentioned, you're specializing in ibogaine, so I'm really fascinated to hear why you got interested. But before you present, just quickly, can you give us some academic background and maybe from the beginning of your journey, what ignited your passion for
Sure,
psychedelics? So just
sure.
give us those two sort of things, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ali, for inviting me to give this talk. It's a great pleasure to be here today online. So my name is Kenneth Shinozuka. I'm from California originally. I did my undergrad at Harvard, where I studied neuroscience. I then went to Oxford for my PhD, where I met Ali, and we became good friends. And I ran the Oxford Psychedelic Society for 3 years. I should also mention I co-founded the Science of Psychedelics Club at Harvard, which then later turned into just the Psychedelics Club. Um, and as far as I'm aware, that's the first psychedelic society at Harvard since the era of Timothy Leary, back when he was getting fired for giving psychedelics to students at Harvard. Um, so I was at Oxford for a total of 4 years. Um, Again, studying neuroscience, although technically my PhD was in psychiatry. I specialized in psychedelic research for my PhD, and now I'm about to start a postdoc at Stanford and the Department of Veteran Affairs. So I'm calling you here from California. Um, Nice to be back in my home state after being away for 12 years. And yeah, regarding your second question, Ali, that's actually the start of my presentation. So I will just get right into it. Okay, so yeah, I'd like to tell you guys about my journey in psychedelic research and how I got involved. Firstly, by the way, can I just make sure everybody can hear me fine? There's no issue with my Wi-Fi connection or anything. We all good, Ali? Great. Okay. So back in 2016, I was graduating from high school and found myself in a very anxious and dissociated state. I remember during that time in my life, I would sit down to read a paragraph of like a simple book, and it would take me hours of reading and rereading to finally understand what that paragraph was talking about. So I was having like a really hard time concentrating on anything, and I really wasn't sure what was going on. Then a good friend of mine introduced me to this book called The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, which completely changed my life. The central thesis of this book is everything in your life happens in the now, in the present moment. Sure, there exists a past and there exists a future, but even when you're reminiscing on the past or thinking about the future, that happens in the present moment. Everything in your life happens in the now. And this book, firstly, completely relieved me of the dissociation and anxiety that I was experiencing in that period of my life. And secondly, opened me up to a completely new understanding of what consciousness and the mind is. So this book makes this interesting distinction between consciousness and the mind. It says that consciousness is like this eternal, timeless awareness that always happens in the now. But the now is itself timeless because it's always now. So consciousness is an eternal, timeless awareness. Whereas the mind is bound to the passage of time. The mind is always thinking about the past or the future. It's never really here now. So, and at this time I was getting ready to study neuroscience in my undergrad, and I started thinking about this dichotomy between this notion that everything is now, but that on the other hand, the brain is a very temporally bound process. On the right, you can see a bunch of different electrical signals from the brain. And the brain is this fundamentally dynamic, changing organ all the time. So how do we relate these two ideas together? And then about a year later, the summer after my first year, I started getting interested in psychedelics for the first time. And I became very interested in psychedelics actually as vehicles for experiencing directly this notion that consciousness is an eternal, timeless awareness. Perhaps even like seeing your consciousness play out across many different lifetimes. Uh, and um, and this again sort of drew me to this interesting divide, you could say, between science and spirituality. So on the one hand, psychedelics like DMT can create this feeling of being in a multiverse of different spirits. This is a painting by the great psychedelic artist Alex Gray on the top, depicting what a DMT breakthrough experience is like. But on the other hand, psychedelics are literally just chemical molecules, right? I mean, DMT is just, a very simple molecular structure, and it's shown on the bottom here. So psychedelics seem to me to be this fascinating bridge between science and spirituality. On the one hand, they were these gateways to ineffable mystical experiences, but on the other hand, they're just molecules, right? So how do we bridge these two things together? I think another way in which the divide between science and spirituality is exemplified is in the way that these two fields deal with the ideas of love and connectedness. Um, so somebody like Rupert Spira, a good friend of me and Ali, would say that he's from the Advaita Vedanta tradition, which would say that love and connectedness are the source of creation. But if you were to, on the other hand, ask a neuroscientist what love is, he would have you scanned he would have your brain scanned using something like an fMRI machine, and then say something like, from an evolutionary perspective, love is an adaptation designed to solve specific problems of survival. And so, the scientific and the spiritual accounts of love are completely diametrically opposed to each other, The scientists are saying that you love people in order to survive, but then, the spiritual teachers will say that love is just the primordial source of creation. It's the inherent nature of humanity. So again, how do we bring these two very, very different fields together? So for a while, I actually grew quite cynical about the idea that science and spirituality could be unified, but then in the summer of 2019, after my third year of college, I interned at this place called the Qualia Research Institute, which completely revitalized my hope in this idea. Um, the people at QRI were the first scientists who I met who believed that consciousness is fundamental. In other words, this idea called idealism. But they were also very practical. They believed that the science of consciousness will dramatically improve our ability to heal suffering. So they weren't just interested in solving consciousness for the sake of solving consciousness. They really wanted to help people. And they also had a very deep interest in altered states of consciousness. They were really precise in their investigation of the phenomenology or the subjective experience of psychedelics and meditation. And at the time, and still now, QRI was very interested in a framework called connectome harmonics, which you could see essentially as a way of decomposing wave-like behavior in the brain. You could kind of say in a sort of in a poetic way that it's a way of sort of analyzing musical patterns of brain activity. And I was interested in this idea that connectome harmonics could be a tool for understanding the science of psychedelics. And that framework, connectome harmonics, was being developed by a team in Oxford that was led by a guy named Morten Kringelbach. I applied to do a PhD under him, and so then I went to Oxford, studied under Morten, did my PhD in neuroscience, as I mentioned earlier, at Morton Center, which is called the Center for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing. Eudaimonia, by the way, is the ancient Greek word for flourishing, so this name literally means the Center for Flourishing and Flourishing. And I had a truly amazing time doing my PhD there. And that was where I met Ali and ran the Oxford Psychedelic Society for 3 years. And we had a fantastic time. Really, the best 4 years of my life spent in Oxford. Um, and while I was doing my PhD, I discovered that there's a wide range of psychedelic experts. On the one hand, you have the very hardcore materialist neuroscientists and chemists who have made great strides in understanding the pharmacology of psychedelics. For example, how strongly they bind to different receptors in the brain. The neuroimaging, in other words, how psychedelics activate or connect different areas in your brain when you put people under an fMRI. But the sort of hardcore scientists' understanding of phenomenology, I think, is still pretty inadequate. We have questionnaires like the Altered States of Consciousness questionnaire, which asks you to rate on a scale from 0 to 100 how much your ego died over the course of your trip. I always found this to be a pretty silly questionnaire because, I mean, we use it a lot in our science and I have used it myself in some studies, but, it's kind of ridiculous when you ask somebody the question, how much has your ego dissolved? And you say At 1 p.m. it was 0% dissolved, but then at 2 p.m. it was 50% dissolved. And then at 3 p.m. it was 100% dissolved. Like it's a, cube of water dissolving and it's a cube of ice dissolving in water. Um, they'll also ask about good or bad drug effects, which I also think are kind of silly. I mean, if you ask somebody at the peak of a trip, especially a heavy trip, are you feeling good or bad? They'll probably tell you, I don't really know how I'm feeling. I'm just kind of feeling strange right now. Um, and then they'll also ask you about the intensity of drug effects. So like rate on a scale from 1 to 10, how intense the drug is. And I also thought this was kind of silly. I always imagine what it's like when they give people DMT, which for those who don't know is a drug that escalates very quickly. So, they might be saying, the intensity is a 0, 0, 0, 10, 10, 10, like it's just like, it's kind of silly. On the other hand, on this wide range of psychedelic experts, you have Paul, who I met at a festival last summer. Paul knows absolutely nothing about pharmacology other than the experiments he's run in his own basement. He's never been in an fMRI scanner either. But he knows a lot about phenomenology, and that's because he's done a lot of drugs. And he's had these very, very rich experiences of transcendence, ego death, and interconnectedness. And so I think we really need to learn a lot from people like Paul, who've taken a lot of psychedelics. And this points to the idea that science ought to be radically inclusive. We really need to bring these two different sides of the conversation together. There's also a third type of experts, which I'd like to highlight here, which are shamans. Here you see some elders from the Yawanawa tribe from Brazil. They actually came to speak to the Oxford Psychedelic Society back in the fall of 2023. They were part of this European tour to raise awareness of their community and how their community is being affected by, globalization, the West, etc. And it was really great to hear from them about the traditions and the ways in which their community runs ayahuasca ceremonies. Indigenous wisdom is diametrically opposed to Western science. But I think it's very, very important that, again, we include shamans in the conversation because, shamans have been administering ayahuasca in ceremonies for thousands of years. And they probably know much more about ayahuasca than Western scientists do. How do we learn from them? We don't really know. That we don't really have frameworks for, unifying Western science with the indigenous wisdom of shamans yet. But I think that's a field in which we'll need to make progress soon. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that there are these essentially three levels at which we can understand psychedelics. There's the pharmacology, the neuroimaging, and the phenomenology. So during my PhD, the first thing that I did was to do a meta-analysis of these three different levels of understanding psychedelics. So at the first level, we have pharmacology, how psychedelics bind to different receptors in the brain. We know that the 5-HT2A receptor, or the serotonin 2A receptor, is a very key mechanism of action for psychedelics. If you block that receptor, then you also block the hallucinogenic and potentially therapeutic effects of psychedelics. Then at the second level, we have neuroimaging. So how psychedelics affect and connect different areas of the brain, which we can measure with technologies like fMRI. And then finally, at the top, we have phenomenology, or the subjective experience of psychedelics, feelings of oneness with the universe, ego death, and so on. By way of analogy, we can compare these three levels to traffic. So you can think of the receptors in the brain as traffic signs, rerouting the flow of traffic in the brain. The neuroimaging captures the traffic itself, or the flow of information between different areas. And then finally, there's the phenomenology, the subjective experience that traffic gives rise to, a feeling perhaps of being stuck in traffic during rush hour. And so we looked at these three levels across three different psychedelics, DMT/ayahuasca, LSD, and psilocybin. So this is the first meta-analysis to date of all three of these levels of analysis in psychedelics. And again, we quantitatively compared three different psychedelics at each level, DMT, LSD, and psilocybin. And then we also came up with a way of relating these three different levels together with a common framework. On the upper right here, you can see a QR code, which will link you to the paper that came out of this. So firstly, with the phenomenology, we did a meta-analysis of questionnaire data from 33 different studies. This is the altered states of consciousness scale that I was mentioning earlier. And so here we just compared LSD and psilocybin. And broadly speaking, we don't really see that many significant differences between LSD and psilocybin. The significant differences are, by the way, indicated with an asterisk. The only categories in which we saw a consistent difference across different doses was this category called visionary restructuralization, which is a very poetic term for essentially describing the quality and intensity of visual hallucinations on psychedelics. And this is interesting because, there's some debate in the field about whether or not there are actually significant differences between the different psychedelics. Some people, for example, researchers in Switzerland, would argue that there is no difference. But a lot of people would say there definitely is a difference. If you ask psychonauts, a lot of them will say that LSD and psilocybin feel very different to them. And one anecdotal report is that a lot of people will say LSD feels more visual than psilocybin. And so that's exactly what we found in the literature, which was cool to see. And then here, essentially what we did was we looked at the different brain networks that correlate with the different subjective experiences on that scale. So here you're essentially seeing how psychedelics, how the subjective experiences elicited by psychedelics activate different networks in the brain. And broadly speaking, you can see that they're pretty similar to each other. Although I will say that you should definitely take this figure with a huge grain of salt because we really don't know the different brain networks that correspond to different subjective experiences. Okay, so then for the second level of analysis, the neuroimaging, we essentially looked at resting state functional connectivity studies in fMRI. What resting state functional connectivity means is when people are experiencing the acute effects of the drug, in other words, when they're high on the drug, we scan their brains, and then using a technology called fMRI, we see which pairs of regions in the brain are connected to each other. So doing this meta-analysis, we produce this matrix where you have the seven canonical networks in the brain, and you can see how much they're correlated with each other on psychedelics. And here, this diagonal that I've highlighted in red shows you the changes in within network connectivity, whereas everything that's off the diagonal shows you the changes in between network connectivity. So we see, broadly speaking, the psychedelics decrease within network connectivity, particularly in the visual network and something called the default mode network. So for those who don't know, the default mode network is a network in the brain that is essentially activated whenever you're at rest. So whenever you're not doing anything, this is the network that's active. And so it's the network that's very much responsible for things like mind wandering, rumination, thinking about yourself. And we've known for a while that psychedelics dysregulate the default mode network. They decrease activity and connectivity within the default mode network. And that's theorized to be related to things like ego death. I personally think that connection is way too weak and needs to be explored with much greater precision. But nonetheless, in the meta-analysis, we did find that all psychedelics do significantly decrease connectivity within the default mode network, substantiating this theory. However, psychedelics increase between network connectivity, and that, again, is very consistent with what we find in the literature. So if you then make this matrix for each of the three psychedelics and then you sum across the columns, you get these profiles, and you can see that the different psychedelics are very, very different from each other. So unlike the phenomenology profiles, the neuroimaging profiles are very distinct for the different psychedelics. Okay, now we go to the final level of the meta-analysis, which is the pharmacology. So there are two different ways in which we can analyze pharmacology. The first is binding affinity, or the strength with which psychedelics bind to different receptors. However, that paints a very incomplete picture of pharmacology because we need to know not only the strength with which psychedelics bind to receptors, but also the amount of activity they elicit in the neuron downstream. And we can see this distinction playing out when we compare LSD to other drugs that also bind to the same receptor. So we know that LSD binds very strongly to the 5-HT2A receptor. It elicits a lot of functional activity in the neuron, and then somewhere down the line that leads to hallucinations. However, if you look at a drug like glyceride, glyceride also binds very strongly to the same receptor, but it doesn't quite elicit that same very strong response in the neuron, and as a result, it doesn't lead to hallucinations. So we looked at both of these aspects of pharmacology. Firstly, binding affinity. Surprisingly, we didn't see strong differences between the different psychedelics in terms of their affinity for different receptors. You'll notice, by the way, that the error bars in this plot are really huge. They're actually much bigger than the error bars in the phenomenology meta-analysis. That, for me, was quite surprising because I would expect to see a lot more variability across studies in terms of the phenomenology because it's subjective experience, right? Whereas pharmacology should be, quote unquote, more objective, more precise. So I would expect to see less variability, but that's actually the opposite of what we saw. Pharmacology had a lot more variability across studies, and phenomenology had a lot less variability across studies. So then we can look at the different brain networks that express these receptors that we looked at. Um, and um, and this figure essentially shows how strongly psychedelics bind to receptors in different brain networks. And you can see that these plots look actually pretty similar to each other. The distribution is pretty similar, but they're essentially scaled differently, and that's because psilocin, which is the drug that psilocybin gets metabolized into, binds more strongly to the 2A receptor, as we saw here, than the other two drugs. Okay, and then as I mentioned, we can also look at functional activity, the downstream response that's elicited by psychedelics. And I won't go into too much detail in this talk because I would have to get way too scientific. But we do see some significant differences between LSD and the other drugs in a particular way of measuring functional activity. Okay, so those are the three levels of the meta-analysis. And if we combine the plots that I showed you from each of the levels, we get this figure. There are two key takeaways. The first is that for some of the levels, there are these clear differences between the different psychedelics. So DMT, LSD, and psilocybin are very much differentiated from each other in terms of their neuroimaging profiles, but not so much in terms of their phenomenology profiles. And secondly, there are these highly nonlinear relationships between the three different levels. So if you compare within each drug, the pharmacology, the neuroimaging, and the phenomenology, you can see that there are no one-to-one correlations. And that makes complete sense. Like there's a lot that happens, right, in the brain between individual receptors and subjective experience or consciousness. So we shouldn't expect to see these one-to-one correlations. In the field, we definitely need to develop much better models for being able to relate these three different levels of analysis together. At the moment, all that we're really doing, especially when it comes to phenomenology, is just literally doing correlations between, like how mystical was your experience on a scale from 1 to 100 and your brain activity. Clearly, this is not sufficient for being able to capture what's actually going on. One of the most promising theoretical frameworks for relating these three different levels together is something called REBUS, which stands for Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics. This was developed by Robin Carhart-Harris and Carl Friston back in 2019. And REBUS is essentially built on the predictive coding model of the brain, which states that the brain is essentially a predictive engine. It's not just passively taking in information from the world, it's actively generating predictions about the world. And what you perceive consciously is not the passive stimuli, but instead the active predictions that the brain generates about the world. And Rebus says essentially, sorry, the predictive coding model of the brain says that these predictions that the brain generates are informed by what are called priors. You can kind of think of priors as the assumptions of the statistical model that the brain creates. Or to put it in layman's terms, priors are like beliefs, essentially, that the brain generates. And what Rebus proposes is that psychedelics decrease the weights of those priors. Now, what that means is that there is less top-down inhibition of those priors on bottom-up sensory information. So in other words, the priors are constraining your brain activity less, and as a result, you're able to perceive a lot more information just coming in from the environment. And that information coming in from the environment is then able to change your beliefs. The reason why this is able to relate the three levels together is that we know, as I was mentioning earlier, that psychedelics bind to the 5-HT2A receptor in the brain. And the 5-HT2A receptor is expressed predominantly in these layer 5 neurons in the brain. And these layer 5 neurons are the ones that are responsible for sort of encoding these priors or these beliefs. And then we also know that the 2A receptor is expressed more in these associative networks of the brain, like the default mode network, rather than the more sensory networks of the brain, like the visual network. And this is perfectly consistent with the fact that psychedelics seem to have a greater effect, the greatest effect on connectivity and activity in these associative networks. And because of the fact that psychedelics bind to the 2A receptor in these areas, they essentially cause consciousness to be more perturbed by the environment. So because of the fact that you are decreasing the weights of these priors, allowing for greater information coming in from the environment that then essentially perturbs your consciousness more, resulting in the very chaotic experience that you have on psychedelics. And that's symbolized here in this image, where you have essentially the red dot is, I guess, the world, and this pond is your consciousness. And you can see that the world is making a much bigger splash in your consciousness on psychedelics. So the key idea here is that psychedelics flatten the hierarchical flow of information in the brain. Why hierarchical? So the priors in the brain are essentially exerting this top-down inhibition on the rest of brain activity, whereas the information that's coming in from the environment, that's bottom-up. And so you're decreasing this top-down inhibition and amplifying this bottom-up information flow. And so as a result, you get this reduced sort of restriction of brain activity by the top-down inhibition. And that essentially results in a contraction of the brain's hierarchy of information flow. The problem with Rebus is that it's quite difficult to test. So we sought to find simple ways in which we could think about hierarchy. And in the second part of my PhD, I spent a lot of time thinking about hierarchy and tried to define hierarchy very simply as a system in which a small subset of components irreversibly drives the activity of many other components. What do I mean by that? So let's consider these two examples. On the left here, you see Brownian motion, which refers to the random motion of particles. And it's a completely reversible system. So if you play this forwards and backwards, you don't really see much of a difference. It's also completely non-hierarchical. You don't have a single particle that's running the show telling, telling particles which direction they need to move in. On the right, however, you see a hierarchical system, which is a motor neuron communicating with a muscle. So, information is flowing from the neuron to the muscle in terms of these electrical potentials. And you can see there's a clear irreversibility in the system, right? If I were to play this in the reverse direction rather than the forwards direction, you would see a very clear difference. And that indicates that there's this hierarchical structure in the system. Information is only flowing one way from the neuron to the muscle and not the other way around. There's this irreversibility. Now, irreversibility defines a local arrow of time because it's inherently distinguishing between events as they're played forwards and events as they're played backwards. And in physics, it's also equivalent to the amount of entropy that's being produced. And therefore, it's directly related to the second law of thermodynamics, as explained in this quote below. And just as a side note, there's an interesting connection here between what I was mentioning earlier about the mind as being bound to the passage of time, whereas consciousness is kind of this eternal, timeless awareness. So something in the brain has to produce entropy in order for the brain to survive, in order for the body to survive. And as a result, it's creating this irreversible activity. So how do we measure irreversibility in the brain? So I used a technique called inside out, which basically looks at the difference between forwards and time-reversed correlations of different pairs of time series in the brain. I won't go into too much detail on this because it can get a bit technical. But basically, we're directly comparing forwards and reversed activity in the brain. So this was a framework that was created by my supervisor at Oxford and one of his collaborators. And here you can see the initial application of it to data from monkeys, actually, who were awake, asleep, and given different anesthetics, including propofol, metatotamine, and ketamine. And what you can see on the left here is a traditional way of measuring connectivity in the brain. And you can see that the connectivity matrices are pretty much the same across the different states of consciousness. You can't really see a very strong difference. But in panel C here, we look at the irreversibility. And here you can see a very, very clear distinction between the different states of consciousness. Anesthetics and sleep consistently reduce irreversibility relative to being awake. Whereas ketamine, interestingly enough, actually increases irreversibility. So our question was, how do psychedelics affect irreversibility as a way of measuring hierarchy? And the answer was to apply inside out to a pre-existing MEG data set in which healthy humans took LSD. So MEG is a technology a way of measuring the brain that looks at the magnetic fields of the brain. And this was data that was collected by my collaborator, Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial College London. And this was collected in 4 different experimental conditions: eyes open resting state, eyes closed resting state, listening to music with eyes closed, and watching a silent video. Resting state, again, meaning that, you're not doing anything. You're either just having your eyes closed or you're looking at a cross on a screen. So here on the upper right, we have a QR code that takes you to the paper that came out of this study. And the first main takeaway is that LSD makes the brain more reversible. So in other words, it reduces the strength of hierarchy in the brain. And this is a pretty consistent effect across all the different conditions. And if you look at different regions of the brain, you can see this, again, very consistent effect across the brain. Interestingly enough, we see that irreversibility tends to be highest in the visual areas and lowest in the more frontal areas of the brain. And so, in other words, it's highest in the sensory regions of the brain because the sensory regions of the brain are essentially just feeding information forward to the rest of the brain. And that's why it's irreversible, whereas the more frontal regions of the brain have this more bidirectional exchange of information because they are engaged in not only feed forward, but also feedback information flow. Okay, so that gives you kind of a quick rundown of my PhD research. There's more that I could get into, but for the sake of time, I'll leave it there. And I now wanted to shift into a sort of bigger picture understanding of psychedelics and thinking about like how psychedelics can be used in society to help people's lives. So there's an urgent need for better solutions in psychiatry. This is a figure taken from the seminal STAR-D trial, in which 4 different courses of antidepressants were given to people back in 2008. And here you can see the cumulative remission with each treatment step. So remission refers to basically the percentage of people who were relieved of their depression symptoms or who were quote unquote cured of their depression, although we don't really use the word cure in psychiatry. And you can see at the first treatment step, so this is the first line of antidepressants, only about 33% of people enter remission from their depression, which is pretty damn low. Of course, that number improves with the increasing number of antidepressant treatments that you get. And so by treatment step number 4, about 66% or so of people enter remission from their depression. But that still means that over 33% of people, after 4 lines of antidepressants treatment, are still not treated. So clearly, we need better solutions in psychiatry. So as a side project during my PhD, I conducted these systematic reviews of clinical applications of psychedelic therapy that were aimed at an audience of primary care clinicians, or as you would say in the UK, GPs. This resulted in 8 papers that were published in the American Journal of Therapeutics, and I also served as a guest editor on this issue. We did a comprehensive overview of all the clinical trials to date on psychedelics. Across many different psychedelics, we looked at LSD, DMT and ayahuasca, psilocybin, ibogaine, MDMA, and ketamine, in addition to writing an introduction and conclusion. And if you want to look at, if you want to see all 8 of these review papers, you can click on the QR code here, which will take you to my blog, and that links to all 8 of the articles. So there are a lot of different clinical trials of psychedelics, but I would say there are primarily 4 main use cases. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, whether that's generalized anxiety disorder or end-of-life anxiety, people who are suffering from terminal cancer and want to be at peace with their death, and then substance use disorders, so alcohol use disorder or alcoholism and tobacco addiction. This is a very, very fast-moving field. And so as I was preparing these slides the other day, I was learning a lot about the different companies that are doing clinical trials in this space. It's very hard to keep up with everything, but here's what I think is the most up-to-date summary of the field. There might be some incorrect information in this slide again because this field moves at such a rapid pace. MDMA for PTSD is the psychedelic drug that's made it the farthest in the FDA process. They had 2 very successful phase 3 trials, but unfortunately they were rejected by the FDA. We don't really know why the FDA rejected MDMA for PTSD. The reason being that the letter that the FDA wrote to the company that sponsored these trials has not been disclosed yet to the public. However, I was attending something called the Bay Area Psychedelic Symposium about a couple weeks ago or so with a panel of experts who were aware of the clinical trial process. And they say, of course, they can't be certain, but they are pretty sure that the reason why the FDA rejected MDMA for PTSD is that the company failed to provide enough safety data on MDMA. So things like how MDMA affects your heart, for example, as well as the recreational, as well as the potential for recreational abuse. And I think that's a very valid concern, to be honest. In the trials that have been conducted so far, nobody seems to have gotten dependent or addicted to MDMA after the trial is over. But we do know that when MDMA is used in a recreational context, it can be addictive. So that's certainly something to keep an eye out for. Um, then there's depression, which a number of different psychedelics are being used to treat. This is entering phase 3 for psilocybin. And then we have anxiety, which is, at either phase 2 or phase 3, and substance use disorder, which is at phase 2 at the moment. I should also mention there's ketamine for a wide range of different conditions, and ketamine is the only FDA-approved psychedelic drug. I say psychedelics in air quotes because I really don't think that ketamine is a psychedelic. I think that its subjective effects are very, very different from the other psychedelics. And sure, ketamine can also be therapeutic, but if you actually look at the literature on ketamine, its effects on things like depression are way, way, way weaker than other psychedelics. There are several clinical trials in which there's actually no significant difference between ketamine and placebo in terms of treating depression. And the other problem with ketamine too is that you need to have these repeated administrations of ketamine. So you have to take ketamine at least once a week, once every 2 weeks in order to sustain the antidepressant effects. And finally, ketamine is also a highly addictive drug. And I think we are vastly underestimating actually the addictive potential of ketamine. I actually had some friends in Oxford who unfortunately got addicted to ketamine, and it was very sad to see. So here are some results from the clinical trials. And again, there are a lot of different clinical trials, and I don't have time to go through all of them today, but here are just some of the highlights. So on the left here, we see a screenshot from a figure of one of the phase 3 trials of MDMA for PTSD. And so in both of the phase 3 clinical trials, we saw that MDMA led to a remission rate of about 67 to 71%. So in other words, 67 to 71% of people were relieved of their PTSD symptoms. And that is a truly, truly remarkable result. If you compare MDMA to things like antidepressants, it's like 2 to 3 times more effective than antidepressants. So I really do hope that MDMA makes it through the clinical trials one day, because I think a lot of people with PTSD could really benefit strongly from MDMA. In the middle, we see psilocybin for alcoholism, but actually, I think an even better use case of psilocybin is for tobacco addiction. So there was this pilot study that was done about 10 years ago or so on 15 people who were struggling with tobacco addiction. They had tried a lot of different treatments, nothing worked, and so they were addicted to smoking for a number of years. And just 2 sessions of psilocybin led to complete abstinence from tobacco for 6 months. That is, again, a remarkable result. 80% of people were abstinent from tobacco 6 months later, completely abstinent. So they hadn't even touched a cigarette 6 months later. Again, vastly more effective than any other pharmacological treatments that we have in the field, and potentially even therapy. And a lot of those effects were sustained years later. So I think they followed up with those same 15 participants like 2 to 3 years later. And even then, 60% of people were still abstinent. And again, abstinence is a very, very strict criterion, right? It means that you can't have smoked a single time between the psilocybin and whenever the study followed up with you. That study was only done in 15 participants, but the same researchers have then scaled it up to now like 50 different participants or so. And from what I understand, they still have a very, very high abstinence rate of about like 50% or so. So very, very promising. And then finally on the right here, we see ayahuasca for depression. And about a week later, there was like about a 36% remission rate. So again, more effective than the existing treatments. However, some results are less impressive. So Compass Pathways, which is one of the leading companies trying to commercialize psychedelic medicine, they had a big phase 2 trial on psilocybin where they enlisted, I believe, 233 participants with treatment-resistant depression. And they showed that only 29% of participants in the high-dose psilocybin group achieved remission from treatment-resistant depression. This is not that much better than antidepressants. So why is that? Yeah, and again, here you can see, as I showed you earlier, that the remission rate from the first line of antidepressant treatment is 33%. Granted, the people who were in this Compass Pathways trial were people suffering from treatment-resistant depression. So they would be the people who are, at treatment step, 2, 3, or 4, as opposed to treatment step 1. But still, the fact that it's only 29% of people who are achieving remission is lower than it should be. And I think it's lower than it should be because of the paradigm that we're currently using in psychedelic therapy, specifically in psilocybin for depression, which is this minimal psychological support paradigm. So in this paradigm, we kind of let the drug do its magic with minimal involvement from the therapist. Participant sits down, they take the psilocybin, you let the drug run its course. The therapist doesn't really do or say anything. At the very end, after the psilocybin trip is over, you might have a conversation with the therapist, but that's it. So a question that I've been interested in is what could happen if there's more intervention from the therapist? Perhaps if the therapist gets more involved in the therapy itself, then we might be able to more fully harness the potential of psychedelic medicine. So I wrote this paper that had this sort of out-of-the-box approach, trying to bridge meditation with psychedelic therapy. On the upper right is a QR code leading to the paper that came out of this, which hasn't been published yet, but is just a preprint at the moment. And this was actually written with my Qigong teacher in Oxford, a guy named Ben Cox, who Ali and I once had the pleasure of interviewing for a podcast. Um, we were interested in the possibility of using Qigong to be able to heal people during psychedelic therapy and as psychedelics for essentially catalysts of the therapeutic process that can naturally arise out of Qigong and Taoist meditation. So I'll just say briefly that Qigong is kind of like a meditative way of moving qi through the body. Many more people have heard of Tai Chi. So Tai Chi is more like the martial arts way of moving qi through the body, and Qigong is more of the meditative way of moving qi through the body. You do these like very sort of slow movements. And Qigong and Tai Chi are both practices within the broader school of Taoist meditation. Taoist meditation is a field that's sort of hard to study because a lot of the information that was passed down in those meditative techniques is esoteric. So it wasn't written down. There's kind of this oral lineage. There are only a small handful of books describing the different meditative techniques. But something that Ben and I were interested in is something called the outer dissolving method in Taoist meditation. So here you don't even move, actually. You just do a body scan and attend to sensations in different parts of the body. And as your power of attention becomes more and more refined, you begin to notice with greater subtlety different tensions in your body. And these tensions, these feelings of tightness, correspond to different emotional blockages. And this is very consistent with what we know in psychiatry. Like a lot of people, will say that, their depression is stored in their chest. And whenever they feel really depressed, their chest tightens a lot, for example. And so the way the outer dissolving method works in Taoist meditation is, you go systematically through your body, you identify these different tensions in your body, and then you use the power of your awareness to be able to gradually loosen that tension. So the more that you stabilize your attention on that tension, it melts from something that's very solid into something that's more fluid, into water. And then as you stabilize your attention further, it kind of expands outwards into gas. So there's this metaphor that's used of, water melting from ice into something more fluid and then evaporating into gas. And so you're essentially using your attention to be able to sort of dissolve the rigidity of these tensions in your body that correspond to emotional blockages. And in psychedelic therapy too, we hear about people kind of naturally having this experience as a result of psychedelics. So if you listen to people's anecdotal reports from psilocybin therapy, for example, they'll say, I realized that my depression was really stored in my chest, and the psychedelics completely liberated me from this feeling of tension in my chest. So my idea was that psychedelics could serve as catalysts for Taoist meditation so that people can feel the emotional blockages in their body much more deeply. So, if you do Taoist meditation, you might, kind of get somewhere over the course of like 2 years, you might start to begin to feel these like subtle, tensions in your body. But psychedelics can significantly speed up this process, and you can go way deeper into the sensations than you could when you're sober. So yeah, I'll just say on that point, this is just an idea that I've written about. I'd be very curious if anybody has feedback on the paper. At some point down the line, I would love to experiment with some form of this in an actual like clinical trial. But for now, it's just an idea. Okay, so what's next? So as I was mentioning at the beginning of the talk, I'm going to be starting a postdoc at Stanford in the Department of Veteran Affairs soon. The idea being to give psychedelics to veterans with PTSD. And one psychedelic drug that I'll be focusing on in particular is a drug called ibogaine. So ibogaine is the primary alkaloid in a plant called iboga, which is native to Gabon in Africa. You can see its chemical structure here. And one thing that's very interesting about iboga is that it's been used religiously for supposedly over 10,000 years in Gabon. There's a religion called Bwiti, a very ancient religion, where iboga is used as the central sacrament. So iboga is taken during central rites of passage, for example, when boys become men during puberty, when people die, and so on. However, iboga is also the only psychedelic drug that can kill you. If you were to take psilocybin or LSD, sure, you could potentially be very destabilized if you had a really bad trip, but it won't kill you. Iboga is the only only psychedelic drug that could actually kill you. And the reason that this happens is that iboga is very incompatible with people who have some kind of underlying cardiovascular disease, and it can induce these life-threatening cardiac arrhythmias. There have been 33 deaths that have been reported so far, although in many cases, it seems like the people who were administering the iboga weren't being careful enough with how the iboga was being administered. So one thing that my lab is interested in is whether there are ways that we can supplement iboga with other medicines to improve cardiovascular safety. So what we're doing at Stanford specifically is to supplement iboga with magnesium. This therapy was trialed on 30 special forces veterans, all with traumatic brain injury, who had a ton of psychiatric and physical disabilities arising from their PTSD, arising from their traumatic brain injury, including, for example, functional disabilities, but also PTSD, depression, and anxiety. And the results of this trial were completely off the charts, even for psychedelic therapy. 86% of these veterans entered remission from PTSD, 83% from depression and anxiety, which is unheard of even in the field of psychedelics. Certainly much, much, much bigger than, the existing pharmacological treatments we have, like antidepressants. So I think there's a lot of potential here. And another reason why I think iboga is very promising is that there's very little potential for recreational abuse. So even with something like LSD and psilocybin, sure, it's not addictive at all. But there are still lots of cases of people taking them at festivals and at raves, and potentially having adverse reactions for a long period of time afterwards. I actually do think that in the field, we are underestimating the number of people who enter prolonged periods of dissociation, anxiety, etc., after having a bad psychedelic trip, or mania as well. Although in the clinical trials, I think people tend to do a very good job of managing the adverse effects that arise from psychedelics. Iboga, on the other hand, is not the kind of drug you can take at a festival or at a rave. It lasts 36 hours. The acute effects are 8 hours long. So during those 8 hours, you are probably lying flat for 8 hours. If you move a single muscle, you will probably throw up. It's kind of impossible to walk or stand up on iboga. It's very, very intense. There's no way that you could function at a rave or a festival while being on iboga. So I think the fact that it can only be used in this clinical context, or in a spiritual context like with the Bwiti, makes it a very promising drug. So at Stanford, we're going to be testing this paradigm on Ukrainians with PTSD, which is going to be very, very exciting. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, Ukrainians have suffered a lot of PTSD from the recent war, and the treatments that are available in Ukraine, like benzodiazepines or alcohol, are very poor at treating people's PTSD. So I'm very keen to see how this could help. I should also mention that another really promising use case of iboga that hasn't been tested yet in the West. Well, I mean, it has been tested, but hasn't been tested well, um, is heroin addiction. So heroin addiction is, of course, a very difficult thing to shake off, and we have different treatments like methadone, but those aren't necessarily very effective. And iboga seems to be one of the best treatments on the planet for healing people's heroin addiction. At the Oxford Psychedelic Society, one of the first events that I ran as president actually was from a former heroin addict who had tried everything under the sun to shake off his heroin addiction. Nothing worked. And then he tried iboga. It healed him instantaneously. And then he went on to found the first ever iboga clinic for treating heroin addiction in the West, and that's based in Mexico. And there are a lot of stories of people going to Mexico to treat their heroin addiction with iboga and being completely healed. It's a remarkable, remarkable thing. And as many of you may know, in America, we have this horrible opiate crisis. 70,000 Americans are dying every year from fentanyl overdose. That is more than the number of Americans who have died in the Afghanistan, Iraq, and Vietnam wars combined. And that's just a single year of fentanyl overdosing. 70,000 people. It's an absolute tragedy. And so we need vastly better treatments for heroin and opiate addiction. And maybe iboga could work. Maybe iboga could really, really save a lot of these people's lives. Another project that I'm going to be working on is this cutting edge technique called ultrasonic drug uncaging. So here we're using ultrasound to be able to target drugs more locally to a specific region of the brain. So if we think about something like ketamine, for example, ketamine is a drug that crosses the blood-brain barrier and then binds across the whole brain. But for a use case like chronic pain, which ketamine has shown some promising results for treating, maybe we want ketamine to bind only to a specific part of the brain, to the specific part of the brain that regulates the emotional response to chronic pain. And so at Stanford, there was this really, really cool technique that was developed to do just that, which is called ultrasonic drug uncaging. So here the idea is that you put the drug of interest, namely ketamine, inside of a biodegradable nanocarrier, and then that drug crosses the blood-brain barrier. And because it's encaged inside of this nanocarrier, it can't bind to any part of the brain unless you use ultrasound to target it to a specific part of the brain. So when you use ultrasound to target it to a specific part of the brain, um, the, um, the nanocarrier becomes more permeable. And as a result, the ketamine is able to leave the nanocarrier at specifically that part of the brain. So in other words, ketamine only binds to the brain region of interest and not to anywhere else in the brain. And so this has been tried in rats, and it's worked pretty well, and it's never been done in humans before. So very cutting edge technique, and we're going to be the first ever in human trial of this technology. And the use case is going to be ketamine for chronic pain. I'm personally very interested to see whether or not the patients who receive this dissociate more or less with this technique than they do with standard ketamine. So we have no idea what's going to happen. We speculate they're going to dissociate less, but who knows? Okay, so I've given you a lot of information today about my PhD research, the clinical trials on psychedelics, what I'm hoping to work on in the future. But I wanted to zoom out a little bit and talk about, just why psychedelics have so much potential. There are a lot of trials showing that psychedelics can be useful in populations of patients who have psychiatric disorders, but I really think that they could be useful for not only psychiatric populations, but also everybody. There's this great psychedelic thinker named Bob Jesse who said that psychedelics can be used for the betterment of well people. And I think the reason why psychedelics can be so effective, even for people who think of themselves as healthy, is that, even healthy people struggle periodically with feelings of dissociation, with feelings of existential despair, with feelings of being separated from the rest of the world. This notion of being trapped in yourself and being separate from everybody else. But psychedelics can reconnect us to this primordial source of creation that I was mentioning earlier in my talk, to this feeling of love and connectedness with everybody else. And those feelings, I think, are feelings that are deeply familiar to all of us. They're feelings of being home. And there's this great quote from Ram Dass, who was a key part of the psychedelic movement back in the 60s. He said, "We're all just walking each other home." And I think psychedelics can bring us to that place of home. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kenneth, for the wonderful presentation. I think you covered so much depth and breadth. So that was amazing. We'll open now to the audience questions. I'll go first just because maybe it would be interesting to get the idea out of my head quickly before I forget it.
Please,
So
yeah.
you mentioned about Taoist practice and psychedelics combined. What do you think is the potential of sort of combining the Taoist practice to maybe like a Sufi, to an Advaita Vedanta practice, and really connect the psychedelic to all the mystical traditions to see where we can go with the science of consciousness? Because obviously the mystical traditions are also really dispersed. They're not really unified, and they're all focusing on different aspects of consciousness. Like with Sufism, you have love. With Taoism, there's a lot of like internal alchemy, like moving the energy. So it'd just be interesting to see from your perspective, how do you see the field progressing in integrating mystical traditions with psychedelics, and what's the potential? Because it just sounds really exciting to me.
Firstly, is there an echo now? Because I took my headphones off and sometimes there's a bit of an
No,
echo with you.
it's good.
Everybody can hear me
Good.
fine? Okay, cool. That's a great question, Ali. It's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So in in mysticism, you can broadly see like two different camps. One is the perennialist school of thought, and the other is the contextualist school of thought. So the perennialists think that all of the different mystical experiences are pointing at the same ultimate truth or the same ultimate state of consciousness. The contextualists, on the other hand, would say that that's not true, and that every mystical tradition is completely different. The truth that they're pointing at is not the same as the truths in other mystical traditions. I used to be a perennialist, and now I'm more of a contextualist, to be honest. I now think that actually these are completely different states of consciousness that the different traditions are pointing towards. Um, I think in the long run, it would be great if we could link psychedelics to to the whole multiverse of different mystical traditions, right? Um, and the thing is, I think everybody has a tradition that resonates differently for them, right? Some people are already Christians or Muslims or Buddhists, right, before they take the psychedelic. And then there are a lot of people who are not so spiritual, right? But they might have like a revelatory experience of Jesus, during the trip, or they might have a revelatory experience of Muhammad during the psychedelic, right? And so there are these mystical experiences that naturally reveal themselves during the trip. I kind of think we have to just let psychedelics call to people individually. I don't think we can impose a specific framework on people. One thing that concerns me about, potentially like bridging Taoist meditation with psychedelic therapy is that a lot of people just might be very kind of opposed to that, They might be like, I just don't, that's not my religion. I don't resonate with that, don't force a religion down my throat, right? So I think it's a tricky question, but yeah, I think we kind of just have to let people experience it for themselves.
Yeah. So, through researching psychedelics in general, I've heard a vast number of accounts of these mystical experiences. And a kind of weird thing I noticed was that people who take a drug at the same dose, for example, they can experience vastly different effects. And
Yeah.
even if you take obvious accounts, obvious kind of factors out, like how fast your metabolism is, body weight, a person who's like much heavier has a much like slower, faster metabolism.
Yeah.
They can experience effects like much less at a
Hmm.
higher dose, and then that
Hmm.
person takes like a way smaller amount, and then they have this like crazy ego death experience. So, what are the factors that kind of determine how strong an experience will be?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So you're right that body weight is one of those for psilocybin. Apparently for MDMA, it's like they initially started by adjusting the dosage based on body weight, but they've kind of stopped doing that. So now they administer an absolute dose instead of a relative dose. Um, you're asking about like generally speaking the physiological factors, or are you specifically interested in one factor or another, like weight?
Uh, Could be any. I'm kind of interested in like how it affects the person as a whole. So physiological, mental.
So are you asking like what are like the predisposing like mental like psychological factors that can alter a person's trip um or just like the general factors that can like
Uh,
alter
I'm thinking more physiological factors that kind of affect it.
physiological? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Um let's see. What else is there other than body weight? That's a good question to be honest. Um I mean, when it comes to something like Iboga, any kind of a heart condition is a contraindication. So, like if you have, whether it's a heart murmur or something else, it's recommended that you don't take it. There are also like medications that can conflict with certain psychedelics. So, like taking MDMA and SSRIs is not recommended and can actually be very dangerous because it can lead to something called serotonin syndrome. Although the risk of combining MDMA and SSRIs in terms of serotonin syndrome is actually way lower than combining coke and speed. So I would also advise against combining coke and speed because that can definitely like flood your brain with serotonin and put you in the hospital. So don't try that at home. Um, what else is there? Those are the ones that come to mind right now. Um, there are also, I mean, I know you're asking about more physiological things, but in terms of like psychiatric contraindications, there are things like, bipolar and schizophrenia that are contraindicated for psychedelic use. Although it's very interesting. So there was a study that came out recently on people who suffer from depression as a result of bipolar type 2. So that's the less severe bipolar. And it's actually pretty effective at managing the depression symptoms. Again, this is when psychedelics are administered in a clinical setting, not in a recreational context. Um, so that could be useful. What was that? What about metabolism? Um, yeah. So, I mean, different psychedelics can be metabolized at different rates. Um, So like DMT, for example, is metabolized way more quickly. Oh, also like how much, yeah, this is an important thing. How much you eat before psychedelics makes a big difference with all the psychedelics. So if you want to like really get the most out of your trip, don't eat before, like fast for a day. In the iboga ceremonies, for example, like you fast. In the ayahuasca ceremonies, you also fast, on the day of the ceremony, for example, or you eat something extremely light for lunch. Yeah.
Uh, Hey, Kenneth, great talk. I had
Thank
a
you.
question on sort of what your thoughts were, because you mentioned like the ibogaine magnesium studies, and they're quite remarkable. But you also mentioned that some of the symptoms, are, like the effects of ibogaine, can last up to like 36 hours, which is
Yeah.
a long period of time. And among the various substances, like there's such a large variability in like the actual length of the trip. Like
Yes.
DMT can last just up to like 30 minutes, but ibogaine's like on the other end of that spectrum.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about like the practical considerations in clinical practice of like the
Yes.
length of these trips and like whether whether time of of like the therapist or the administrator is like taken into account?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are several considerations at play. The first is the like financial consideration. So one of the like big driving forces in the field of commercial psychedelic medicine is to shorten the length of the psychedelic trip. The reason being that, whenever you're administering a psychedelic to somebody, you need to have a therapist present, obviously. But obviously that adds time, right? So if you need somebody present for 36 hours of a psychedelic trip, obviously that's extremely expensive. So there are people who are creating like Beckley SciTech is a company, for example, that is creating a shorter version of psilocybin. So psilocybin normally is 4 hours, and they've managed to create some kind of chemical formulation that makes the trip only 2 hours long. So people want to shorten the length of the trip. There's also a lot of interest in DMT and 5-MeO DMT for that reason, because of the fact that the trip is only 15 to 30 minutes long. So that's like the financial consideration. The other consideration is like the therapeutic or neurobiological factor. So there's some very interesting research that's coming out of Gould Dolan's lab at UC Berkeley, who says that the length of the therapeutic effects scales with the length of the trip. So she belongs to the school of thought that says that basically psychedelics open what's called a critical period of learning. Like psychedelics open this window of time in which you can like relearn a lot of like fixed behaviors. like, for example, addiction, the thought patterns that drive depression, and so on. Um, and so the longer the drug effects, the longer the high, the longer the therapeutic window. So it's supposedly longest in iboga because it's the longest drug, and shortest in ketamine, which could explain why ketamine requires these repeated administrations repeated administrations across multiple weeks. Now, there's this very interesting exception with DMT because DMT is only 15 minutes long, but it can have this very long critical period. Why is that? My personal speculation is that DMT subjectively can be experienced much longer than ketamine. So you can be in the DMT breakthrough experience for what can feel like hours upon hours. Um, could that be a part of the healing effects? Maybe. I think that the jury's still out on that, and that's purely my own speculation with no scientific evidence.
Anybody else? John, or if anybody else wants to ask Kenneth a question, we give it
Yes,
5.
hi.
Yeah.
Yes, this is a great presentation, guys. Thank you very much. I'm just curious, with the strains, if you're familiar with like Golden Teacher, Tidal Wave, Penis Envy strains, how does that, if at all, align with your studies and your research?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. So what John is pointing to is that there are different strains of psilocybin mushrooms that can have different intensities. So in all of the research, we're not giving people mushrooms, but we're instead giving people psilocybin or psilocin, which are like the psychoactive molecules inside of the mushrooms. So what makes the mushrooms different in part is how much psilocybin is in the mushrooms. So for example, like penis envy will have way more psilocybin than weaker strains of mushrooms. So the reason why we give psilocybin is that makes it much more standardized. So like, we can give like, the same amount of psilocybin to different participants. Does that make sense?
Yes, great. Thank you very much.
Great.
We have time for 2 more questions if anybody wants to go. Mario, you want to go?
Yep. Yeah. One question I had about the things that you said about relieving tension during a psychedelic experience, or in particular during therapy. This is just a very random thought, but I was thinking that one of the main functions of serotonin outside of the brain is actually the regulation of muscle contraction. Do you There's any
Fascinating.
relationship between the things that you said and that? Probably
It's a
not.
good question. Well, it's interesting. I mean, so like MDMA, so one thing to note about psychedelics, the classic psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, they don't necessarily increase the amount of serotonin in the brain. So they bind to serotonin receptors, which influences, communication in the brain, but it doesn't influence the actual amount of serotonin that's being produced by the brain. MDMA, however, does vastly increase the amount of serotonin in the brain. It floods your brain with serotonin. Anybody who's ever taken MDMA will know that it leads to this behavior called gurning, where your jaw gallops like a horse, and you get all these twitches in your body. That is likely a result of serotonin being increased, and your muscles like kind of contracting a lot as a result of it. For the other, like the mystical experiences and the hallucinogenic effects, no idea.
Anybody else wants to go? I think
Hi,
somebody.
I have 2 quick questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, please go for it. Also, by the way, I should say I'm in no rush, so I'm happy to stick around as long as people would like.
Awesome. Love the talk, by the way, very informative. While I was looking at a few papers, there's no research done beyond the late 1900s into HPPD, and there's a 4 to 7% chance of that occurring and actually causing rebound anxiety and worse symptoms in a few patients back then when it was researched. So what do you think is the state of that? Is it being explored at the moment as well, or is it just
Did you say 47?
4 to 7?
427. Yeah, okay, that makes more sense. 47 would be way too high.
Yeah.
I think it's anecdotally, like I know people who have struggled with HPPD after trips, sometimes lasting a very, very, very long time. For some people, it's an issue. Like HPPD can be very anxiety inducing, but for other people, it's not an issue. Like these like sort of light hallucinations kind of just become a part of their visual perception and they're okay with it. I do think it's definitely an issue to be addressed. And I know that there is some research that's now happening in the clinical space on this, but not a lot of academic research. Um, so yeah, I definitely do think it's something we need to mitigate for sure. As far as I'm aware, in the clinical trials on psychedelics, nobody has really reported this as like a long-term adverse effect, or maybe like only a small handful of people. I think it's in the recreational context where this is more of a concern. Although I don't really know why that would be the case. It could be sometimes that there are interactions with other drugs, right? You know, when you're taking psychedelics at a festival, but you're also taking other drugs at the same time. I don't really know, to be honest.
Okay. And my second question was in regards to salvia. Is that being explored at all?
It's my girlfriend Jenny, by the way. She was also a big part of the Oxford Psychedelic Society. Sorry, you asked about salvia, right?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, salvia is a very interesting substance. I actually have a colleague at Oxford who refers to salvia as not dissociatives but transsociatives. Because things can happen on salvia, like you turn into the zipper on your jacket, you know, so like you dissociate from your body, but then you like reassociate into like some inanimate object. Um, Not very much research has been done at all on salvia, and as far as I'm aware, there are zero clinical trials of salvia to date. A funny little side note about salvia. Salvia is the only psychedelic that is legal recreationally in multiple states in the United States. The reason being that it is so horrifying to so many people that they don't want to take it more than once. So it's not addictive to people. So I think like in California, salvia is legal actually, but just nobody wants to do it more than a single time.
Kenneth, I had another question for you. So you're a scientist, and you from the worldview where majority of people, your colleagues, are actually materialists, right?
Yeah.
Maybe not in the psychedelic domain specifically, but in the neuroscience and psychiatry, and also philosophy of mind. I'm a philosophy student here. Majority of academics are materialists. What is your hope? Like, what does it take? Does it take like giving these academics a certain a number of trips for them to change their metaphysics? Like, what's the
Yeah,
bar? Because
it's a fascinating question, Alan. I'm very glad you
it
asked
just
that.
feels like there's so much evidence already of altered states
Yeah,
of consciousness, and there's
yeah,
so much
yeah,
availability as well. Like they can go and do this, have these experiences. What is
yeah.
like if you were to say, okay, what could change in society that will change the worldview from materialism to something more expansive, more, I don't know, maybe idealist or panpsychist way where we feel
Yeah.
this oneness with the earth or maybe with others, as in like the
Yeah.
self is not separate. We're not just made up of matter. There's something beyond the physical, because
Yeah.
psychedelics, like unlike mysticism, is giving you like scientific, like a replicable way to
Right.
experience these states. It's
Yeah.
not just spontaneous. You don't just have a mystical experience. Like you can decide you'll do some mushroom, and then you have this experience. So it's just, yeah, that's sort of my question for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Great question, Ali. I think, as I was mentioning, psychedelic science is a very fascinating field because you do have a lot of pharmacologists and chemists and neuroscientists in this field who have, I'm sure they have tripped in their own lives. But the way in which they describe the psychedelic experience can be so cold and so exacting and so removed from the magic of the psychedelic experience that you wonder whether they ever tripped at all. For example, there's a lot of research happening out of Switzerland, and they use the funniest terms to describe the things that happen on psychedelics. So, like, there's this one guy, Matthias Liechti, who runs a lot of really, great and pioneering research on psychedelics. And he refers to the cuddle puddles that take place on psychedelics as piling. um, you know, yes, and we observed that the participants got together and they piled. Like, wow, okay, interesting. Anyway, I think it's interesting. It is a testament to the fact that the mindset with which you approach psychedelics is everything. So, you know, if you are a hardcore pharmacologist and chemist, you approach psychedelics with that mindset, and then, and then you come out of that with a perspective that is, very, sort of rigid. And the interesting thing about psychedelics is that, I talked about this idea of rebus, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. But I think a more expansive and a more correct view is something called albus, which is called altered beliefs under psychedelics. So that refers to the idea that psychedelics can both relax beliefs and also strengthen beliefs. Um, and this is true. I'm sort of digressing a little bit, but this is highlighted best if you look at cults that have emerged around psychedelic use. So, like for example, the Manson family, right? Like they use psychedelics as tools to brainwash people and to reinforce certain like very, very false beliefs. So, if you go into psychedelics with a very specific worldview, you can come out of that with that worldview strengthened. It all depends on the context and how open you are to having your beliefs revised. So, to your question, will just taking psychedelics help people, relax from a more materialist worldview? Not necessarily. It depends. And I also think that materialism is not a harmful ideology in of itself. I think you can be a very happy and peace-loving materialist. I think dualism is actually a much more pernicious worldview. The idea that the self is separate from the world, I think, has led to vast amounts of suffering. And I think a lot of people who operate from that perspective aren't reading, Cartesian or dualist philosophy. They just kind of absorb it from our culture. Um, so psychedelics for treating dualism is something I support.
Hi. So earlier on, you mentioned that kind of critical learning period that's unlocked
Yep.
under psychedelic experiences, and I'm thinking, is there any way you can bolster or strengthen that kind of critical learning period? Because you mentioned like under other psychedelics is not as strong as it is on DMT, even though the length of the experience is different. So is it intensity that controls the strength of the critical learning period, or is it something else?
So it's supposedly just the duration. I mean, yeah, again, DMT is kind of this interesting asterisk. But it is supposedly the duration and not the amount that you take. So even if you took 1,000 micrograms of acid, it would not open your critical period more than taking 100 micrograms. That's the theory. I think it's yet to be rigorously tested.
All right, Kenneth, thank you so much for coming to join us
Great.
at the St Andrews Psychedelic Society. We really enjoyed your presence, being here with you. And yeah, thank you for your wisdom, for your knowledge, and hopefully we get you back soon.
Yeah,
Sometime,
absolutely.
hopefully in person, actually, it will be wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, happy to speak anytime. And if you guys make it big and you can fly me out to Scotland from California, I will say yes in a heartbeat.
We'll
But
do
yeah,
our
thank you
best.
so
We'll
much.
do our best.
Yeah, thank you so
without,
much, Ali, for the invitation. Always happy to come speak to you guys.
of course, of course. Amazing. Thank you.